Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Baer, Communications and Development Coordinator for PSRPA. Thank you all for joining us for the fourth Climate Emergency Feedback Loops Film Club. And I'm really happy to see all the returning people as well. The panelists for this evening are Joellen Russell, an oceanographer and climate scientist and a professor of Integrated Sciences at the University of Arizona. Her research includes global climate and Earth system models to simulate the climate and carbon cycle of the past, present, and the future, and develop observationally based metrics to evaluate these simulations. Our other panelist is Sarah Rosengard. She's a chemical oceanographer and assistant professor at the School of Art of the Art Institute of Chicago. And her past research has focused on carbon cycling in the southern ocean of the Amazon River Basin and different applications of, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, so sorry, photoplankton satellite imagery. Since 2018, she has been doing work in the Arctic Eldred Society, which is an Inuit charity based in the Arctic. And then the moderator for this evening is Pouné Saberi, and she is an occupational medicine specialist in Philadelphia and a PSRPA board member. In 2012, after increased concern about environmental toxins, she completed a second residency in occupational and environmental medicine. As a PSRPA board member, she works on projects related to health and natural gas development in the Marcellus Shale regions of Pennsylvania. And as always, please use the the comments for any questions you might have, and we'll answer them towards the end. And I'll pass it off to Pouné.
Thanks so much, Emily, and welcome everyone. I love seeing all the faces I know. So nice to catch up with you, even if it's virtually. For those of you who saw the film and all the other films that that are that have been narrated by these famous people like Barack Obama and whatnot, my voice isn't like Richard Gere, but I'm going to summarize what the concept of the topic of tonight's discussion is, and I'm so excited to be joined by two experts, and I'm really even more excited to, have a discussion. The chat box can be used for Q&A. So please enter your questions there, and we can see how it goes. If they're relevant to what we're discussing, we'll incorporate it. If not, we'll make sure we'll get to it before the end of our discussion tonight. But I hope that our hour here tonight will be very educational. Okay. So as we know, Earth is warming from burning of fossil fuels like oil, coal, shale gas. The atmosphere fills up with heat-trapping gases like carbon dioxide and methane at levels that, as Joellen says, have not been seen in 3 million years. That's a long time. In addition to the releases of these heat-trapping gases, the warming is setting in motion other warming mechanisms on Earth that feed upon themselves. That's what we call a feedback loop. One of the most important warming loops is due to the loss of sea ice and the loss of the role it plays in what is known as the albedo effect. So my first question is for Sarah. You teach environmental chemistry to art students. So cool. If you were going to tell your students about albedo, how would you teach it? How would you explain, like pretend we're your students, like how would you explain it to us about what is the albedo effect?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today. And it's nice to see Joellen again, because we met before, like, I don't know, a year and a half ago. So I think because I teach art and design students, I definitely want to give them the challenge of understanding the science that as they would learn it anywhere, but I also like to emphasize like some of the more experiential and visual aspects of climate change science. And so I'd probably, because albedo is about ice, I know that probably a lot of my students in Chicago have are not from the polar regions, but we are familiar with cold ice, snow, and actually lake ice, which looks very similar to sea ice. And for us, Lake Michigan pretty much looks like an ocean. So I would probably start by giving my students access to the wealth of compelling visual imagery of satellites of ice from space, from satellites that exists as open access data. And I would allow them to just explore, visualizations of Chicago from space in the winter months on dates that they would have experienced the winter and the lake ice themselves or the shoreline themselves. So I'd probably start by that. And then I'd go more into what albedo is. So to explain it today, albedo is the measure of Earth's reflectivity, and climate change is all about the balance of energy coming into Earth and leaving it. And so when that's out of balance, the climate will change, the global average temperatures will change. And that's the issue with greenhouse gases. Albedo kind of has the opposite effect to greenhouse gases because it reflects energy out of Earth. And so in situations where there's higher albedo, higher reflectivity like from sea ice in the polar regions, when there's more of that, then the Earth is able to reflect more energy out. And so the issue with this positive feedback, this reinforcing feedback you mentioned in your introduction, is that as greenhouse gases are causing the average temperatures of Earth to rise and more ice is melting, then Earth is losing its reflectivity. And so that's actually preventing Earth from reflecting more energy out, thereby leading to more warming, more melting of sea ice, and then the loop kind of continues from there. But I think I would start, again, explaining this concept through visual, because reflectivity has so much to do with light energy, and it's such an innately visual thing. I think that's the starting point, at least, for understanding albedo.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. I definitely would say that the visual imagery in the movie was very compelling. So I agree with you that the kind of that image is worth 1,000 words. Joellen, you had described growing up in a community that has witnessed all these changes in the patterns of climate. I'm really interested in hearing about the community, kind of your experience growing up. What were those changes? What was your experience? What was your community's experience? That tell us about all that.
I grew up in an Arctic fishing village, which is actually above the Arctic Circle by about 30 miles. It's called Kotzebue, and it's actually on the Chukchi Sea on the Arctic Ocean. It's now I'm not native. My dad worked for Indian Health Service and took care of folks on the Kobuk and Noatak river systems, flying out from the hospital with the public health nurse to look after folks, basically landing on the rivers when it was icy and landing on the rivers when they had pontoons, when it was wet. And so it means I had, this was emotional to see how much the ice has broken up, because we had long, hard winters back when I was little, and we had to wait for the barge to be able to come up through the Bering Strait and bring food in, because we had plane flights every day, but it was incredibly expensive to get food that way. So almost everybody was in subsistence. So that doesn't happen the same way anymore. The Northwest Passage is open now. It's open now, mostly on the Russian side, not on the Greenland and Alaska, Greenland, Canada, Alaska side, but it is much, much more open than it was. There's cruise ships going through there and shipping, which always worries me, because you can flash freeze that ice really fast. One storm away from a whole ship being locked in, engines down, and no one there to rescue them. But so the changes were, so this inspired everything. I'm an oceanographer. I use robot floats and supercomputers and satellites. And, my students deploy floats into the ocean around Antarctica and around the world. And so we're watching the ocean warm, we're watching sea level rise, we're actually looking at the seasonal cycle of acidification in the ocean. And all of that work, you know, that it's a lifetime now, was inspired by the community and the environmental changes that were already ongoing. And Kotzebue is now one of the endangered Alaskan villages on the federal list. It is a very scary thing to think about friends and family losing their homes and their livelihoods. Anytime I see less sea ice, it scares me because, you know, polar bears are ambush predators. They like to have a nap out on the ice, right? They just want to, because when you have monolithic sea ice, when it's all locked in, basically all the marine mammals, you know, the beluga, the seals, they have to come up to blowholes in order to breathe. So, you know, Joe polar bear goes out there, finds a blowhole and has a nap until he hears somebody pop up to breathe, at which point he just scoops them out of the water and has snacks. And he expended like near zero energy doing that hunt, right? When there's no sea ice, he has to either hunt on land, you know, and the effect of that is we now have pizzlies and growlers, right? Where grizzly bears and polar bears are getting together. So we are in a new world. And the fact, and now it's basically, I spend more time doing carbon accounting in the ocean to help with global carbon accounting from our fossil fuel emissions, because if we don't bend that curve and bend it hard, and a lot of that leadership is going to have to come from right here in the United States, we're going to lose some of these things. And that sense of loss was just real and palpable, but we need to not despair. We need to bend that curve. It needs to drive us to action, not apathy, right? So I was impressed. I was, and a lot sad.
Yeah, I can understand. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to come back to the robots in 1 second because that fascinates me. But Sarah, can you, so speaking of kind of the contribution of, you know, people who live there, you co-developed an app with, you know, some of these communities, SIKU. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, or Siku. Can you explain to us like how you went about developing it? How does it work? And I understand, you know, that it's being used right now. You know, how is it helping the communities that it was designed for?
Yeah, I was definitely thinking about that when Joellen was talking about Kotzebue. Is that how you pronounce it? Okay. So I didn't, so Siku, the app, or the Indigenous Knowledge Social Network, was piloted years ago by communities around Hudson Bay, which is a body of water in the Canadian Arctic. And so I didn't play any role in developing that, but I was involved, and I still am involved now. It started out, I mean, I just want to say I was so lucky to be part of this project, even though I didn't play a role in creating it in any way. I got involved more because of my ongoing work on satellite imagery of ocean algae and how that would play a role in this app. But let me talk about the app first, and then I can speak to a little bit to how I think it's so important for communities to be using it. But Siku, which is how it's pronounced, is an Indigenous knowledge social network that was created by Indigenous communities for Indigenous communities in the Arctic. It's a platform that exists as a mobile app on your phone, but it's also a website, siku.org, and it brings together different sources of knowledge about the environment, land use, and climate change. Like Joellen's response before is like a combination of all those things, I think. And it's all about land use and climate in and around Arctic communities. So it's a place where people who have the app can share their own environmental observations of the land, of the ice, their own hunting stories in their own languages, dialects, and terminologies, all at the same time, sharing that alongside like cutting edge scientific technologies like satellite data, which was more what I was working on, weather forecasts, dangerous sea ice conditions. So it's like where all different forms of knowledge come together, because they're all important for understanding how this environment is changing. And so, yeah, I told you already, it was piloted years ago by Indigenous communities around Hudson Bay. It officially launched in 2019. So again, I was so lucky to be involved and there around the time that it launched, because that was really exciting. And now I think around 12,000 people use the app, mostly in the Canadian Arctic, although I'm trying to figure out, we're trying to work together to figure out how it would look in Greenland and Alaska as well, because communities from there have expressed interest in using it, and shouldn't just stop at the political border that exists between Canada, Greenland, and US. Why I think is so important is, again, global warming is happening fastest in Earth's polar regions. And that's where tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people live experiencing this change, even though the communities probably contributed the least to the cause of climate change. So I think climate change in the Arctic is fundamentally an environmental justice issue, and this app helps address that. It supports community-driven research, education, and environmental stewardship in the Arctic. And so most importantly, the people who use the app retain ownership of their knowledge, so no one else can steal it. The knowledge stays in their hands so they can figure out how to mobilize it when it all comes together in this one place. And so I think it's important because it's making this knowledge available quickly, immediately, in such a rapidly changing place. And it keeps that knowledge in the hands of the communities that really need to use it.
Thank you. That's so interesting. I noticed that Tanya had put the link in the chat. So please, everyone, check it out. I think that that's, that sounds so fascinating. I love hearing about it. It makes me think a little bit like an app like Fact Tracker for Pennsylvania. PSRPA does a lot of work, and Halt the Harm does a lot of work about kind of the impacts of shale gas extraction, development, production, transportation, and we look at a lot of the health impacts from it, and and apps like that I really believe are very empowering for the community. They also contribute to things like citizen science, etc. So really I'm glad to hear about that. Now, Joellen, let's go back to the robot thing. Tell us about it. Tell us, what is carbon accounting? How is the work of these robots utilized for carbon accounting? Who are the main characters in this whole kind of robot, cadre? And just tell us about how the information is transmitted, gathered, etc.
Absolutely. So it's interesting that the accumulation in the atmosphere of carbon dioxide is really the part of only 2 out of 4, half of the carbon molecules that come out of anybody's tailpipe or from any other carbon polluting activity. Only half of it stays out hanging in the atmosphere, actually contributing to our increased global warming, which, just so everybody knows, we have Earth's Radiation Budget Experiment, which is ERBE. It's a series of satellites that sits out of the edge of our atmosphere, and it looks out of the sun and into the earth, and it says, this is just a back Sarah up here, it basically measures how much solar radiation is coming in, which is about the same, doesn't change that much, and how much is going out. And it's less every year is the answer. Less every year gets out, which it means it's staying in. So we need to figure out not just who's emitting what and how much, but also how it's changing. Most people don't know, and here's for action, not apathy. In the US, we've dropped 20% off our peak emissions since 2007. 2007 just coincidentally happens to be the year that the Supreme Court ruled that the Clean Air Act does in fact include carbon dioxide as a pollutant in the explicit language. That was the ruling in 2007. And since then, the US has dropped 20% in less than 15 years, right? I mean, let's see. Yeah. And what's interesting about that is if the Climate Act actually works, we will meet our cutting our emissions in half by 2034, which is only 4 years after like our aggressive sort of Paris Agreement kind of goals. I mean, can you imagine we're going to get, so once upon a time, we were 22% of the global emissions, and today we are 13% of the global emissions here in the United States. And if we get where we think we're going to get with this Climate Act, we are, by 2034, we will only be 6% of the global emissions while being 20% of the global economy. We've been growing our economy and our population while bringing our emissions down, which is extraordinary. And I love to document this. So we know what's happening in the atmosphere really well because Dave Keeling back in 1958 started measuring from Mauna Loa in Hawaii and from the South Pole. And then eventually we have a global network of stations watching the atmosphere. And since the whole atmosphere is well mixed within a year, if you emit something, you know, your car tailpipe, 2 atoms will stay in the atmosphere of that CO2. 1 will go into the greening of trees and plants on land, and 1 will go into the ocean within a year. That's just how that works. So the big problem with attribution of the net emissions, I mean, including ag and wildfires and burning of waste, all of that, not just fossil fuels, but the whole impact of a country's emissions on the atmosphere. We knew what was happening in the atmosphere, but there were big uncertainties on how much greening. And the really big one was what's happening in the ocean. And it's 25% of the total, so you can't ignore it. And the problem there was in 1989, at the end of the Cold War, we had so many research ships, and we don't have more now. In fact, as we've mothballed ships, we actually have fewer ship days to do research in the ocean than we did back in 1989. And this is terrible. We have this global climate emergency that is critically dependent on ocean heat uptake and ocean carbon uptake. All this dramatic sea ice loss, all this big changes in ecosystems and habitats, and how do we get to see it? Satellites can only see the surface. I'm so sorry, I'm gonna have to cough here. Hold on just a second.
Do you want to take a minute and get yourself a glass of water? Yeah, take your time. Get yourself a glass of water.
I think the tickle's gone.
Okay.
But so the big thing that happened was oceanographers are sneaky and awesome. And in 2004, they started deploying robot floats. Now, I wasn't part of this. I was doing climate modeling and ocean modeling with supercomputers, and that was lots of fun because I didn't think we were ever, I used to go to sea all the time. I've spent more than a year of my life at sea around Antarctica in the winter, making measurements of carbon, et cetera. And I figured out really quickly, we were not going to be able to make enough measurements from ship. It's expensive, $50,000 a day, bare boat. $100,000 would get you about 5 profiles in the ocean of what vertically is going on. 1 robot float will give you 250 profiles and will last more than 5 years and cost less than $100,000. So if we hadn't, so we're moving from this understanding of an ocean that does not change, a steady state, an idea of infinity, that it's so vast, so big, that it can't possibly be changing because we are so small and it is so big. But what we found now that so we would only measure certain parts of the ocean once every 10 years. We would get a ship out there and make those measurements, and it cost $100,000 for every 5 profiles. So we were really just incredibly limited. Now they started this Argo array, and 50% of that array is paid for by the United States and deployed. We were the originators of both the floats and the deployments, but a quarter of it is done by Europe now, and a quarter of it done by the rest of the world, these float deployments. Now, I wanted to do carbon, that carbon accounting. I'm a little obsessed. So when I found that the floats were working really well, I got together with a bunch of friends and we founded a pilot project around Antarctica called Southern Ocean Carbon and Climate Observations and Modeling. And we instrumented the floats with carbon sensitive sensors, nitrate to get the food for the plants, oxygen to see what they were doing, and we started deploying them in 2014. We've been doing this now for 8 years. We have a global array funded, most of which has already been deployed. So we've gone in less than 20 years from an ocean you only saw a peak at every 10 years to a real-time ocean, because the robot floats do a profile, come back up to the surface and beam the data back by Iridium satellite in a 5-minute burst. And it goes immediately online, open source for the entire world to see, is ported onto the global telecommunications service so that all of our weather, all of the weather forecasters in the world can use this data immediately in their dynamic models. And, you know, whether it's a hurricane or just the day's weather forecast, which for shipping, for just in time, for management of ecosystems and fisheries, it's extraordinary. So 20 years ago, we didn't know how, we couldn't do it. We were restricted to ships. And now we can see the entire ocean breathing and changing and growing and the sea level rising. And it's amazing. It's a revolution in oceanography, and it is incredibly scary. You're seeing the pictures from these amazing videographers in this Albedo movie. But what we as scientists are seeing is the impact of this change and the co-feedbacks that are occurring round and around as we keep polluting and polluting, and the atmospheric CO2 goes up and the ocean is struggling to take up more as it warms and mixes. We live in interesting times. And yeah, we are dropping our emissions while growing our economy and our population. So this job is not too big for us. We can do it.
I almost feel like what you're talking about, kind of these like numbers going up and like I feel like that should be on the cover of Wall Street Journal, you know, like this, like in addition to the stocks, you know, like there should be
there
like
should be a ticker on the CO2, because in fact, people don't understand that atmospheric CO2, once you see it, the increase, every molecule will be working to make us hotter for roughly 600 years.
Yeah.
600 years.
Yeah.
So
stays in the environment.
We really need to get on this.
Yeah. So, you know, so PSRPA, you know, is a health-based organization. One of the things that we do is educate and advocate for learning about health impacts of climate change. You had talked about this kind of how the opening of this Northwest Passage, and it's because of the degradation of what's happening in the Arctic. You know, and I can't help wondering, you know, and there has been some talk about like the health impacts of that. So can you speak a little bit about that, you know, in general about the ice melting, but also about, you know, whether the opening of this Northwest Passage has any health impacts?
Well, the big one is it's created traffic, meaning ships are notorious, especially for shipping purposes, are notorious. They basically burn junk oil, the absolute worst stuff, full of cadmium, hasn't been cracked properly. It's nasty stuff. You can see the absolute black plumes coming off these ships. Second, they dump their garbage. Their crew has to eat and do other required functions, all of which do not get processed or saved or treated, because in international waters, you can just dump it. So where does it go? It just sits, it hangs out. You've got everything from E. coli to nasty black carbon onto the snow. And the shipping didn't used to be there because the Northwest Passage was not open. Now it is. And think about a whole cruise ship full of people and what kind of impact that could have in these very fragile ecosystems. And then you have to think about the fact that as it opens and the permafrost starts to melt and you rain more and snow more onto land because of the feedback from this polar amplification, the hydrologic cycle starts to ramp up. It rains and snows more, and you've got runoff. Now imagine that some country, Russia, has left a whole bunch of barrels in that Gulag archipelago all across the Arctic and the Siberia, and those rivers are basically draining this newly not frozen refuse all the way across. Everything you thought you had stored that would stay there for 1 million years because it was frozen It's now available and running into the ocean, and it's being flushed there by the climate feedbacks that are driving all that extra rain. So yes, I worry about PCBs. I know we banned them, but not everybody did. And there's whole buckets of these sitting in places. There's waste of all varieties from power plants, et cetera, that were basically locked up in what they thought was the deep freeze frozen storage, which are not anymore. So here we have this incredibly fragile ecosystem with these species under stress, everybody from the top predator down to Sarah's phytoplankton. And we've got bigger storms with more water and more ice that just comes and goes. I am concerned. I am deeply concerned. We need to slow this down. We need to give everybody more room. We need to make sure that if we could bend that curve and bring it back into closer to balance, what we would end up with is a healthier Arctic, both for humans, and it would allow, for oceans, the solution to pollution is always dilution. So what we need is to let it take longer, let it flush out more, and not keep pressing so hard with so much CO2 and these big changes. We just need to let it heal, let it rest, and not press quite so incredibly hard on the very fragile ecosystems there. I hope everybody, it matters for the humans who live there. It matters for their way of life. And it basically, I always felt like our Arctic, like our Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, I felt like they were sort of a saved heritage for our great grandbabies that maybe we could visit one day. But I knew that it was there and beautiful, and that it was mostly pristine, and that we had protected it so that it would still be there. So I worry that maybe it won't be if we don't hustle.
And Curtis also mentions what I had kind of briefly talked about before, which is that there's a speculation that loss of the ice and permafrost thawing will release new pathogens. And if we have never seen it, then we don't have the immunity. So yeah. And Sarah, I have another question for you, but I just wanted to tell you, like when Joellen talks about like this 1 out of 2 carbon dioxide molecules, isn't it true that 1 out of 2 oxygen molecules that we breathe come from phytoplankton? I don't know if you know that or not, but I just wanted to give a shout out to phytoplankton.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. I think my grad school Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution has a t-shirt that you can buy, like with every other breath, thank the ocean, because of the photosynthesis coming from all the algae phytoplankton communities living in the ocean. Yeah.
Okay. So I want to go back to this kind of idea of art and science. Can you talk to us about how art helps communicate climate science? And many of us are kind of in education about climate, and maybe help us give us some ideas, some examples of specifically how art can help communicate this. Maybe, for example, the health harms that are caused by climate change, but also, other topics related to it.
Yeah, sure. I can give an overview and a couple of examples that have come up in just being at the Art Institute, at the School of the Art Institute, and teaching there. It is really interesting that you ask this. I mean, thank you for asking it, since I do work there. Because right now I'm involved in this, it's so cool, like this new art and science team at the American Geophysical Union, which is a huge, it's convening a meeting in December, which is going to have tens of thousands of earth scientists going. So it's like one of the largest earth science and climate science conferences that are out there in North America. And we're curating a couple of exhibitions, art exhibits at the conference that are bringing together artworks that speak to the environmental crises and climate crises. And it's really interesting just looking at the submissions so far. I think we've exceeded like 100 submissions to the virtual exhibit now, for example, and it's really giving us a deeper perspective of the wide range of ways that art and science are coming together to converse and think about climate change and climate change solutions. And so there's like many ways to answer the question. I'll just have to focus on a few, but I think communication is one of the big ways that art can speak to climate change and address it. And I think that's because a lot of the mechanisms of climate change are at scales that are difficult to comprehend. At least the driving mechanisms, like carbon dioxide is technically an invisible molecule. And so I think there's a cognitive gap sometimes between the driver of climate change and the impact of climate change. And I think art can kind of help make that easier to see and comprehend something that's invisible. Can't help but compare that to COVID sometimes too. There was so much issue, at least maybe in the beginning, with understanding, with like achieving public understanding and the public being on the same page about COVID. I can't help but wonder if part of it is because it's a virus and you can't really see it because it's submicroscopic. So I think art can kind of draw attention to what we cannot see and help achieve an understanding that goes beyond what scientists can understand. And they can do it art can do that in creative ways. I think art can bridge other divides too, because I know I mentioned environmental justice before and how I really deeply feel that climate change is that an issue of justice. And I think that art can help bring out that understanding as well. Because when you think about climate change or like fossil fuel pollution, like in Chicago where I live, it's the lower income communities, the communities of color, communities with less resources, communities that have contributed least to the problem, who are the ones that experience the impacts or are exposed to fossil fuel pollution the most. And that's totally unfair. I think art can help give these communities a voice and a tool for sharing their experiences of climate change as well. These communities are not often the ones who have typically led research even on climate change or anything like that. And so I think art can help bridge that divide too. And so an example of that in Chicago, because I know some people in the room are from there, there's things like the Earth Art Chicago Environmental Justice Art Grant, which is supporting public art on environmental pollution and climate change in Chicago through public art, murals, theater, design, landscape, re-envisioning landscapes. So I think art can play all those roles in communicating hazards, and then designing new solutions, for the future. And so to give one example related to the Arctic, I have my students read excerpts of The Right to be Cold by Sheila Watt-Cloutier. Sheila Watt-Cloutier is an Inuit, is part of an Inuit community in Canada. And I don't know if she calls herself an environmental activist, but she's done a lot of stuff. She's represented Canada and Inuit communities in Canada a lot on international policy talks and discussions and negotiations on climate change. So that's what she's done. She's super inspiring. And so she wrote this book, and she gave an example in the book about negotiations in limiting the spread of persistent organic pollutants in the Arctic. Because of climate change, a lot of industrial pollutants, synthetic organic pollutants like DDT produced elsewhere at lower latitudes are being transported more quickly and vigorously into Arctic food chains. And they were starting to see these pollutants in the breast milk of women in the north. And so
can you imagine telling mothers to stop breastfeeding and use formula because it wasn't safe?
Right. And there's so much issues just with that statement. And it was difficult. That chapter is all about how difficult it was to kind of arrive at, a negotiation on that discussion. But she just gave one anecdote that I try to get my students to focus on, because it was about giving a soapstone carving of a mother and her baby to to people at the conference, and how that helped sway the minds of some of the decision makers there. And so it was actually an example of, despite all the science and all the neat like conversations that were done around this issue, one of the impactful anecdotes in that was the role of this artwork, this carving, in kind of swaying the final decision. So it's just one specific example, but there's so many examples of, I think, artists stepping up to the climate change conversation and designing solutions that maybe we wouldn't have thought of if we didn't think outside the box.
I co-teach a class on climate and health with Dr. Julie Becker, who I think is among the audience today. And we always kind of go back and forth where I'm like, oh, data speaks. And she's like, personal stories speak. And it turns out that there is actually this poem that I heard about, it's called Ring of Fire. And this poem was about like the impacts of climate change on this family. And it still like haunts me. And I'm like, okay, yes, personal stories, definitely, through art and poetry. And we have a couple of comments, and I think I saw one where Bonnie was talking about, she's one of the filmmakers and she commissioned several artists globally to create artwork around the 5 films. And you can see it, you can follow them on Instagram, on Twitter, Facebook, and it's called Climate Loops. So thank you for sharing that. And then Ned Katire shares a link about illustration. It's illustrated haikus about the IPCC report. I got to see this one. I hadn't seen that one. Sounds fascinating. Going back to the prior discussion about the Northwest Passage, Alan Greengrass report that posts that there was a case of a child dying from long frozen anthrax infection as the permafrost thawed in the Russian Arctic. Right, and then Tenier posts the Right to Be Cold link. Thank you so much. And we have a question that says, will a warming ocean continue to absorb the same percentage of emitted CO2 as now? So that's actually leads right into the next question that I was going to ask you, Sarah, which is that if you can answer that question in addition to this piece, which is that if we cut down on our emissions, like, as Joellen is describing, will this ice reform? Like, will it refreeze? And like, will it help break this, like, this feedback cycle, positive feedback loop? And if you need me to repeat those, let me know.
No, it's okay. I can see the chat question about so carbon dioxide dissolves less as the solvent's temperature increases. So as the ocean temperature warms, less carbon dioxide will be able to dissolve. And then in addition, there's another issue with the more carbon dioxide that does dissolve in the ocean. And I think Joellen will be able to speak to this because it's carbonate chemistry and stuff like that. But as more carbon dioxide takes up space in the ocean, there's a reduced capacity for the ocean to actually dissolve more of that too. So there's like a diminishing returns with the ability of carbon dioxide to dissolve in the ocean. So it's almost like another positive feedback loop. And then the other question, so if we cut down on emissions, will we stop the loop? I guess the short answer would be, I think this is a tough, complicated question. The short answer is, I think if we understand thermodynamics and the climate system, reducing how much greenhouse gases we're pumping into the atmosphere and slowly letting that amount decrease will, shift the heat budget on Earth, like I mentioned initially, and so it would give the Earth the chance for the polar regions to kind of accumulate ice again. But I think the complicated issue with that is, the real question maybe is like when that would happen, because I think there is some inertia in our climate system where there is going to be some degree of change that has to kind of play out. And so the real question is like, when it's more the time scale, like when will the diminishing ice kind of change its direction and start accumulating again? With that said, I think I want to be clear that it's not too late to do things. Like, we have to do things now. I think we need to be aware that the Earth is changing now, and we need to adapt and rebuild communities and social systems in a way that's gonna give everyone a chance to thrive in the future environment, or in the environment that's changing now. But at the same time, we can't forget that it's fossil fuel emissions causing all of that. So we need to give ourselves the most time possible to slow the pace of all these changes and to turn it around as soon as possible. So we need to, there's no hesitation. We need to change and reduce our carbon emissions now. So I don't want to kind of detract from that final point. Like, it's still all about our fossil fuel emissions being the driver of climate change. But I'll give Joellen a chance to also add to that.
Absolutely. And Joellen,
Scientists-
while you're at it, also include your thoughts on the Inflation Reduction Act.
You know, it is it's a good start. It's a good start. I would prefer that at all levels of government, just like Sarah just said, it's the carbon. It's the carbon. Everybody needs to understand we need to reduce the amount of carbon dumping, carbon polluting, period. Reduce the amount that heads to the atmosphere. So I used to be a big fan. If you were going to get rid of lots of plastics, hey, why don't you just incinerate them instead of putting them in a landfill? Because once upon a time I thought landfills were bad, but incinerating was good. And then I understood that plastics are hydrocarbons, right? They are fossil fuels. And if you burn them, you are just adding CO2 to the atmosphere. So really, there is room for recycling and reuse. And there is also lots of room to stick it back in the ground where it won't cause any damage. Right? Landfills, yes. I know that sounds crazy, especially if you live in New York, but it's actually really, you took it out of the ground, you used it, you put it away. Ha, birth to death. And absolutely. So really, some of the things that I think will help save the planet. Really excellent municipal waste disposal. Also, really excellent electric power production in a distributed fashion. So whether you are generating your power on your roof from your solar cells, or if you are using a heat pump so that you don't need to use as much energy to cool or warm your house. I mean, these are extraordinary technologies that really, really work, and that each of us individually can start deploying at home. The same way we deployed LED bulbs, and everybody's like, well, I don't want to go LED. And then all of a sudden they realize that they don't break and they last like forever. And the amount of energy that they use is like tiny sips. I mean, really, did you know that here in Arizona, we use less electricity now than we did 10 years ago, even though there's more of us and we're actually using more devices, but our devices got really, really energy efficient. And efficiency has become it's like a gold mine. It's like a gusher of oil that does not hit your atmosphere. So, I am just in love with all our amazing engineers, from our hydro and nuclear and geothermal and heat pumps and solar and wind and offshore wind. I mean, we have extraordinary innovation. I am excited about the Climate Act. I wish they'd put even more emphasis on quickly bringing these to, hey, we'll forgive half your loan if you get it done in 5 years, right? Show me you're making the power with no carbon emissions in 5 years, and I'll forgive half your loans. I mean, they're doing it for students, I would do it for green power too. I'm not a politician. I don't know about these things, but anything we can do to accelerate transitioning to electrical sources away from directly burning, which, by the way, talking about human health, everything we burn is bad for us. It's just plain bad. It's bad for our air. It's bad for our asthma. It's bad for our babies. It's bad for our miscarriages. It's bad for our lungs. It's bad for our cancer rates. It's bad for our old people. I mean, it's bad for our pets. burning is bad. We should stop doing it. And whenever you can, like, I'm totally eyeing this induction stove. I got to tell you, I'm like all excited. I'm like, ooh, hubby, look, you could put your hand on it and it's not even hot. Now, I know that's crazy, but this is new tech. We got to embrace the new for better, but with very specific goals. No more carbon dumping. Let's do it. We're already at 13% of emissions and still 20+% of the global economy. Wouldn't it be cool if we were 6% of the emissions? And, and that's what I think the Climate Act is going to get us by 2034. So how far can we drive it? How quickly? With efficiency, with more diverse and distributed and resilient power systems. I am so excited about this. And here in Arizona, we get 43% of our electricity from a nuclear power plant where all of the waste sits in an Olympic-sized swimming pool in the backyard within the security of the plant. I am a huge fan because it sits on a little parcel of land that is the size of like a Walmart supercenter and its parking lot. And it's paid for because it was built 50 years ago. And I'm looking at it going, so, okay, that looks like very nearly free power with zero carbon emissions. How much do I love you? This is, the awesomeness of tech innovation, of embracing, vintage, new to you, thrift shopping, because anything that you are extending the life before it hits the landfill is free. It didn't cost any carbon emissions to anyone. Woohoo! I just know we can do this, save a buck and save the planet all at the same time. Careful, wise investments from individuals and businesses have already got us 20% down. We're on our way and nobody even noticed. So I have just an enormous amount of optimism. I mean, if we can beat Hitler, we can do this. And yes, I do think it's going to take American leadership and we're going to have to decide to get in the war. But we can do this. We can do this. We can save the planet and, probably make a few bucks while we're doing it. But I'm really, really excited. I think the Climate Act is a good start. I'd like to put a little more hard-nosed carbon accounting under that, but that's just me. I want to be able to verify that what they say is doing it is actually doing it. But I think it's exciting.
Thank you so much, Joellen. I just want to highlight some conversations that are happening in the chat box on the shifting away from this culture of consumption. Comment about carbon tax with dividend return of revenue is a way to accelerate reduction in fossil fuel use, which is what we've been talking about as the primary driver of climate change. And then the Inflation Reduction Act offers a lot of carrots for that. Rachel says the oil and gas industry is currently working to build out massive oil and gas infrastructure projects like the export terminals that will lock us into decades of more greenhouse gas emissions while harming communities. Stopping the industry, stopping oil and gas extraction, and stopping these projects is crucial for our health and survival. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more with Rachel. I
fully appreciate that perspective, and that has to be our goal. But we really have pretty effectively used natural gas as a crutch to get us down the first chunk. Natural gas switching from coal to natural gas was an important part of that first 20% whack. There's more we can do, further we can get, but I think we need to be, and I understand why we want liquid natural gas terminals. While I completely agree that infrastructure is expensive, I also think that what we're really trying to do is get Germany to stop turning its coal-fired plants back on every time Putin sneezes their direction over their gas lines. So we're really just trying to support them in not doing more massive coal burning, which you do know they turned off their nuclear power plants and had to turn coal plants on. It's actually flattened emission. I mean, Europe was dropping their emissions pretty smartly, almost as fast as us. And then Germany turned their coal power plants back on when they turned their nuclear off, and we're stuck now. So I just want to say, I completely agree with the switching, but I think we need to be flexible over these next couple of decades. Not flexible, i.e., let's support new subsidies, but understanding that, I think in this case, it's actually biting us in the rear end that we don't have a liquid natural gas terminal to help back up Europe in the face of Putin's aggression and the fact that all these coal-fired plants could be easily switched to natural gas, which would immediately drop the emissions and provide the power. So I understand, but
right.
this
I
is
think
partly why I want to do that carbon accounting so that we're all on the same page.
the this group is like a group that there's been calculations that where methane emissions from natural gas and LNG terminals contribute to climate change, possibly just as much as coal, and in some calculations even more so. So we can almost spend a whole hour on this very topic, which is like energy. And like you're in the right group here. Like this is like, I feel like at the end of this, we're just now getting the chat started. But I also wanted to highlight what Gia had said about the Global Peace Project. There is a post about that. So please take a look at that as well. I really wanted to do this because we have 1 minute left. I don't know, what do you all think? Should we do kind of have people put in their, one personal action, one policy action in the word bubble? What do you all think? Should we end with that? Let's do it. Okay. Yeah. So I really want to thank our speakers and we will have a last word from them as well as the audience in the form of a interactive technology that Ryan's going to walk us through. And I so much appreciate like all your wisdom and expertise. And I hope we can continue this conversation. I loved it. And let's switch over to Ryan.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so we wanted to end by inviting everybody to share in the chat an action that you believe is Pouné, can you help me phrase this?
Yeah, I said, so tell us so here's what's going to happen. In the chat box, you're all going to write down one thing you're going to do on the personal level and one effort you're going to make towards policy change. And then there will magically appear on this on the screen that Ryan's going to share with us.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, and then as you type into the chat, things are going to emerge on the screen. It's going to be really interesting to see what words we come up with. So oh, okay. So this is made for one word, apparently. Let's see. Cool. Yes. So if you see a word that you agree with, you can also add that word again, and it will bump it up. Feel free to make multiple contributions. All right, we're starting to see some themes emerge here. Fantastic.
Oh, I see. And then the word gets bigger. That's cool.
Love it. This is so cool.
I think we'll definitely share this with folks after if you'll capture a screenshot for us.
Oh, yes, definitely. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating in this. This is our first time unveiling this tool, and it's amazing to see all the responses coming together.
Woohoo! That is really cool.
Yeah. And thanks everyone for participating. It's the first time we tried it and I love it. That's great. Oh,
Okay.
we'll put induction.
Well,
Amazing.
in closing, this is Pouné Verkaitis. I am the executive director of PSRPA. I'd like to thank our speakers. I am really kind of invigorated by your passion action, not apathy. I'm going to be tossing that around for the next couple of months and years. And I just feel that you have shared information with us in a way that has been very digestible, but also engaging. And I thank you for that.
Great.
Thank you, everyone. Ryan, over to you, and thank the audience for participating.
Fantastic. So as we wrap up, I just want to share right here on my screen. I'm posting right now. I'm posting in Halt the Harm Network an event reflection. So I grabbed the screenshot and I'm posting it in. And this is Halt the Harm Network. This is an online network where we can stay connected. And what I'm going to do is I'll put the link in the chat, and everybody's invited to join in the network and create a profile. This is the link directly to the Climate Emergency Film Club. And what we're doing right now is we are organizing an online summit for mid-November, and we're going to be interviewing dozens of leaders from around the country. We have a 5-person interview team, and we would love for anybody here that's doing work on protecting their communities from the harms of oil and gas to step up for a 15-minute interview. And I'm going to reach out to some people as well, but I'll put the information in the chat. It would be really fantastic if we could bring up these important conversations in an online summit, be organized with multiple tracks, promote it to over 20,000 people on our email list. So we're really looking forward to bringing a big awareness and connecting all the dots between the different issues in this online summit. So check out Help the Harm to learn a little bit more about how we're building a more connected movement through this online network. So thank you so much, and thanks for letting me take a moment to share what we're all about. And it's also where we'll post the recording, and you can leave comments about this session as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sarah and Joellen.
Thank you.
Bye.